Hi, thanks so much for tuning in. My name's Nicola Kemp and I'm editorial director at Creative Brief, and it's my pleasure to introduce this panel in partnership with the Gerety Awards. The Gerety Awards are unique because they redefine the standard to which advertising is held. Named after Francis Gerety, the copywriter who coined the slogan, "A diamond is forever," the awards mark the first time that juries have been brought together to select the very best in advertising, all advertising, not just advertising made for women, through the female lens. So I can't think of a better time for a creative reboot. So sit back, relax, grab a cup of tea or coffee and prepare to be inspired by some of the best women in the business who are going to lift the lid on some of the most exciting trends in the work, as well as giving us some practical insight as to how, as individuals, we make the conditions where we can actually create the best work of our lives. So with me today, I have Vicky Ross. She is the copy chief and also jury chair. I have Natasha Nana. She's director of creative strategy, EMEA at Whaler. I've got Sarah Rose. She's executive creative director at VML YNR. And then last but not least, I've got Shanice Mears, head of talent at the Elephant Room. Hi, everyone.
Hi, Nikki.
Hey.
So we were judging yesterday, which was just a whirlwind of incredible work and lots of really interesting discussions. And so, Vicky, I'd love to kick off with you because this year's judging, it took place in Brixton at the School of Communication Arts. And we had students sitting in on part of the process, which was really interesting. And opening the judging, Mark Lewis, Dean of the SCA, spoke about the importance of reciprocity and leaving the industry better than you find it. And I'd really love your view. I mean, what does that look like in practice, particularly when it comes to judging? Also, that's a word I can never say properly, reciprocity. It's a tongue twister, isn't it?
It is. I was impressed. I can't say it. I'm not even going to try. I'm not going to say it in anything that I talk. I'll say giving back, but I guess as a copywriter, I'm always looking for different ways of saying things anyway. Yeah, I really wanted to host the live judging at SCA yesterday because students are always entering awards without knowing what the process is. And I thought this was a great opportunity for them to sit in, watch the entries, watch us debate and just see what happens. But that's a side note. So in answer to your question, what does giving back look like when it comes to judging? It's universal that creatives look to award winners for inspiration. So it's up to judges to choose the work that will set the standard for the future and obviously to reward that work so that creatives continue to do better.
Thank you. And Shani, I'd love to bring you in here because the Gerety Awards are really unique because they do view the work through a female lens. I mean, what do you think is the benefit of shifting that lens?
Well, for one, I think it breaks down a lot of stereotypes. Like often we all know that the industry that we're in is heavily male dominated. And I think a lot of the time, because it's heavily male dominated, things are always seen through the male gaze. And I think the opportunity when it comes to an all-female lineup or an all-female judging panel, you kind of get rid of the idea of the male gaze, and essentially we get to sort of, I suppose, hold the baton and enter a place that doesn't feel siloed, where it's just women entries or it's just topics in and around women, but actually it's topics in and around the mainstream of advertising, and it allows us to see that it's almost like breaking down a stereotype that we can still do that and it can still be normal without it being siloed to a topic that is surrounding womanhood. And I think that's really important for the industry as a whole, to be honest. And I think back to your point around students, it's important that they see that, like that representation firsthand, that as women, particularly senior women in the industry, they've got like such incredible experience. So when the Gerety have set like a sort of standard of like when they're coming into it, they won't think that the norm is just the man. Do you know what I mean? They'll think actually like females are judging awards, males are judging awards, and there's a real open conversation around what the work looks like, and it doesn't feel like it's biased because it's always coming from a male lens.
That's so interesting, and that whole area of stereotypes is such an important one. And I know it's such a cliche, but the whole idea that if you can't see it, you can't be it. is something that really has a practical application. And Sarah, I'd love to bring you in here because judging itself is such a unique experience, right? It's just such an opportunity to look at a real breadth and depth of work. From your perspective, because I think it was so interesting doing it at the SCA as well, because there's often a lot of secrecy and a lot of smoke and mirrors around judging processes sometimes. So I love that transparency. What do you think the benefits are of judging? Because I always see work that I've never seen before, and I spend my life writing and looking at work. So I always find it really, there's always more to learn. What's been the biggest highlight for you?
Well, I totally agree that there's so much work out there that we don't see. And I think it's because, even though we're really creatively curious people, we do live in our bubbles, and some of our bubbles are bigger than others. But they're these bubbles all the same. And we tend to see the work, outside of judging, that we, based on the media that we consume, or the things we're curious about, or where we live, or the experience that we've had in life up to that point, or even sometimes the language we speak. And for me, judging allows me to sort of step outside that bubble that I have around me and see work that I wouldn't ever have crossed paths with, and be really inspired by it, and to take a larger view on creativity and insights on the challenges that people are facing in different places around the world, and how it's being solved through creativity, or finding what we have in common. And for me, that is always really really rewarding, to see creativity on a much bigger scale, and have it, as a judge, have it served up to you. You don't have to go find it, just have it all there for you to sort of enjoy and be inspired by, and be jealous of.
That's so interesting. And I love that you've brought up bubbles, because it's so true. We do all exist in our own little bubbles, and it's so good to get out of those. And Natasha, I'd love to bring you in here, because we saw such a diverse range of work for a truly global audience. Looking back on the process, were there any pieces of work or ideas which surprised you or were unexpected? And does judging help you learn and evolve?
Yeah, definitely. I think touching on everything that the other guys have said, particularly with the fact that we're kind of put into this space where we are open to and looking at campaigns from all across the world, which we may never have come across. I think that's my favorite thing about doing something like this and a process like this. So some of the stuff that I guess was unexpected for me is when you dive a little bit deeper into these different cultures and what their values are, or maybe their communities, what they really kind of hold dear, and that's why they've centered an advertising campaign all around it. I think there was a lot of discussion yesterday that we had about this campaign that was all around the importance of taking a bath, which I think for us, it's just actually, I think for us, we just almost maybe take it for granted that that's not maybe something that we would do to relax, or maybe we wouldn't necessarily think of that as something that would mean so much. But I believe it was Japan. It was like this Japanese culture where for them, that actually is a huge, huge thing for a woman to step away from childcare and to be able to have an hour back to have a bath. And that was the Dove campaign, I believe. So there were things like that, which I think when you're put into this, when you're doing something like this, you really sort of see how things do change depending on which region you're in. And that's one thing that I really, really love about kind of exploring with awards that are on a global scale too.
That's such a good point. And that Dove example is such a great one, because our levels of expectation are so different, aren't they? A treat in the UK might not be considered a bath without your kids. That might be just something that you have every day. But it's so interesting looking at the work as a whole. And I was trying to pull out trends last night, and it's so interesting, isn't it? Because we often talk in such absolutes in advertising, don't we? It's like the metaverse is a huge thing. This is huge. And actually, there's lots of contradictory trends that we saw, from just like pure escapism and joy to kind of some really tough campaigns around the climate crisis. And Vicky, I'd love to get your view, because it's always really interesting looking at those trends and the work as a whole. But one of the really interesting takeaways is arguably the contradictions, right, between the really joyful escapist work and campaigns which really actually reflected emotionally what we've been through in terms of the pandemic. And I think that's such an interesting space. And there's kind of a broader conversation around toxic positivity at the moment as well. And I'd really love to get your view. I mean, what were the standout trends from the work for you?
Well, I think you've pulled out the trends in the types of work that we saw, but it's difficult because for me, I want escapism in advertising. The news tells us and shows us all the real stuff, the trauma and the devastation that's going on around the world. But as with anything, if it's done right, it will feel right. And some of the work we saw really pulled out the true emotions of the past couple of years and presented them back to the audience in a relatable way. And not every brand or agency or ad can do that. But then it's the fun stuff that lifts the mood. So while the world collectively grieves for a past life and unites in a unique experience, it's a light-hearted or even funny ad that can unite us again, but enjoy. You know, like an ad for a fizzy drink doesn't have to save the world. It just has to remind people it exists and tell them that in a memorable way. Some brands need to leave the heavy lifting to the heavier categories, or they could run the risk of looking opportunistic or careless.
That's really good advice. And Sarah, I'd love to bring you in here because with that kind of joy versus some of the bigger campaign issues that we saw brands like IKEA addressing the climate crisis, do you think that we've reached an inflection point and we'll see more creative responses to problems which can sometimes feel a bit too big to solve by consumers and creatives alike?
No, absolutely. I think we'll see more responses. I mean, we are creative problem solvers by nature. And it reminds me of that old joke, you know, how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. And there are a lot of these societal elephants that we deal with, you know, from climate change to inequality. And you know, so many of these issues, well, yes, they affect everyone, but there's so many nuances when you get down to different cultures and geographies and, you know, even sort of political and economic factors. But what that does, and all of those things at place, it creates so many opportunities for us to take more bites out of these elephants. And because you know, things like climate change and some of the other big issues that we face don't stand still. I don't think creativity is going to stand still. I don't think it's like, here we've done some ideas and it's done. We're constantly evolving the way we think about things and the opportunities in front of us. So I think we will see more. And I hope that, you know, as we see more, we see an even broader range of sort of tones and ways to address these so that it doesn't become, you know, as I say, advertising, which I think sometimes is a bit of a trend, but that we can really sort of speak to people in an insightful way that gets them moving forward in a positive direction.
I love that point about tone and advertising. And it was definitely something, you know, looking at the work on a global scale that, you know, yes, there are like particular ways of talking about things like the climate crisis, but there was such a diversity of tone. And Natasha, one of the beautiful things about judging awards like the Gerety Awards is you can move beyond some of those generic and often binary statements when it comes to things like the metaverse. You know, some of these things, they just don't seem practical until you actually see them in the work, if that makes sense. And the work almost reminds us what's possible. And what stood out for you in terms of trends or work moving the dial in terms of use of gaming or digital platforms in that kind of really practical way?
Well, I think going back to what Vicky said, I really liked the idea that advertising can be and should still be some escapism, because working in social media, I feel like that's what social media is used best for as well. It's like, don't get bogged down in it, but use it as this kind of platform for escapism or to show your passions. And what I really love to see is when a brand really understands that, is people are so passionate when they're on social or in the digital space that you can do something really exciting and it doesn't always have to be a hashtag challenge. And I think, again, working in social, you can really start to just go down that one track always of let's just do a TikTok about it. But there was one, I believe it was a program, I think it was Canal Plus, it might have been a channel or a program, and we saw this one come up quite a few times. They'd entered it into a few categories, but I loved it every time. I thought it was just such a good idea of putting the advertising. They put a billboard into the Grand Theft Auto game because they'd identified that that's where their audience was. You know, they were meeting their audience where they are, and they were advertising in a unique way, completely digital. But why not put a billboard into a game, you know, because you're still going to get that promotion, but it's something exciting, and your audience will really appreciate that because it's different. You know, you're speaking to them on a level that they really get.
It's so
so I love that one, and I think the metaphor and everything, I'm still oh sorry, you go.
It's so interesting, isn't it, because we sometimes see kind of thought leadership articles about the metaverse, and it just feels like this big, far-flung, amorphous, almost like unpenetrable thing. But when you say something like, oh, a banner for a TV campaign in Grand Theft Auto, it becomes much more tangible, and I think that's really interesting. And Shani, I'd love to bring you in here because and going back to some of the points that have been made already in terms of, you know, some advertising can be joyful. It doesn't always have to be, you know, sadvertising or very serious. One of the really interesting things about the Gerety Awards is obviously that it's all judged through the female lens, but at the same time, we've seen quite a lot of cynicism around femvertising and brand purpose. And looking back over the work that you've judged, do you feel positive about the power of brand activism and actually the potential of the industry to really drive positive change?
Yeah, I definitely do feel positive. And I think the one thing is that, because we were talking about it yesterday actually, is about giving people the room to learn. And I think sometimes as we get older, particularly as adults, you get less patient with other adults because you're like, why don't you know this? But actually what the Gerety Awards, I think, has allowed a lot of us to do, which we just spoke about, is be exposed to different cultural nuances and understand in certain countries they do things a lot different, they speak different, they use different language, different tones, and they also use different people, you know, to then express that or project the message that whatever they're trying to display. But I feel like the one thing that is really important that they're doing it. I think it's all about trying, being transparent, talking about things that we hadn't talked about before. Like we saw one ad that I particularly really liked, which was Norwegian, and that was about it being, you know, legal to marry whoever you wanted to marry and celebrating that. And I think that's really important. Like that's something, regardless of where you are, you know, you can relate to because you know the importance of global autonomy around being able to love who you want to love. And I think those kind of things are important, not just in our industry, but just, you know, across society. And I think that when you're starting to see brands display that, and brands talk about it in a way whereby they're like, okay, we see you, a lot of people who often go unseen or often feel underrepresented finally can look at something and feel like they belong. And I think that when you see brands pushing those types of messages, you you feel hopeful because you're like, okay, like, you know, they get it. And I think that, like, there are still, again, like things to learn about, quote unquote, like, you know, for example, we talked about climate change. We've still got a lot to do in that space, I think, and that's no one person's responsibility, that's everyone's. But I think that the fact that you're seeing brands talk about it more, organizations and different people getting involved and trying to push a message to lots of different demographics, it's like, again, you become more hopeful that, okay, you understand that this is really important, because actually 10 years ago that just wasn't happening. So I think it is a real hopeful time right now for the industry, because I think people are starting to understand that being culturally different, being, like, you know, environmentally aware about different things is really important, not just for us as marketeers, but us as a society. And I think that is much the way I'd much prefer to be going that way than any other way, to be honest.
I love that hopefulness and that point around giving people the room to learn, because there's definitely a lot of opportunity within the industry, but also a lot of pressure on people's time. And really for our sort of final theme, I'd love to talk a bit about actually the conditions that we need to create this sort of work. Because a growing mountain of evidence points to a workforce in a bit of a state of overwhelm. According to Microsoft's annual Work Trend Index report, there's been a 252% increase in weekly time spent in meetings for the average Teams user since February 2020. And in terms of giving people the room to learn, like that's actually quite tricky. And Sarah, I'd love to bring you in here because right at the beginning, you were talking about cultures of creative curiosity, which is such an important thing for creating the kind of work that we've all been looking at. But in reality, that can be really difficult to achieve that. What do you see as key to creating that kind of culture?
For me, there are a few things. I mean, number one is respect for the people that you work with. And that is from all disciplines. I think sometimes we think creative culture lies solely with people in the creative department, but I always say the creative output is only as good as the strategy that went into it, the relationships that, you know, we've built with clients and trust, or media partners and how they place it. You know, we are very much creativity is a team sport. And I think respecting one another and what we bring to the table helps us flourish. And helps great work get out there into the world. I just think optimism is massively huge. It is very difficult sometimes in this industry to not be cynical, to not be frustrated when something doesn't quite go the way you planned it. But I think being able to take setbacks and not view them as fatal to an idea, but an opportunity to try something different, ultimately can get us to great work. Because sometimes that first idea you had isn't always the best idea. It may be the most obvious idea, but it's through pushing through that you sometimes really arrive at a gem. And I think the other thing for creative culture is really an openness to say, maybe I don't always have the best idea, maybe somebody else does, to be really open to another person's experience or another way of looking at a problem. It goes back to that bubbles thing. I think we have to sort of step out of our own experience and maybe some of our own prejudices that we have about certain things to be able to see it in a new light. And to be open to sometimes not getting it right and not being ashamed of it. You know, I think creativity is all about experimenting. And I think I think having those things in a culture, you know, especially that openness to do things a bit different, and whether that is not having as many meetings or getting different people on different projects to have a different point of view. I think that for me is what really fosters creativity. And it all comes down to the people and how they interact with each other.
I love those points. And I love that you mentioned kind of optimism, right? Because that's the brilliant thing of judging, and actually the sort of energy that Gerety brings as a kind of unique judging experience, being an all-female jury. That energy and that optimism is such a positive thing. And Shani, reflecting on the kind of whistle-stop tour of work, I mean, we've seen a lot of work yesterday. There's been just so many different examples of brilliant creativity, but from your perspective, what do you see as the core ingredients to brilliant work? And that doesn't necessarily always have to be the type of work. It could be the time or the space that you have to sort of think about things in a different way. What would your advice be?
I think to Sarah's point, like, it's not just the creativity, but it's actually the process. And I think we talk a lot about it, you know, at our agency, about beginning with the audience. And again, like, obviously Natasha also mentioned, like, we learned a lot about the cultural nuances that mean things to different audiences and to different people in different places. And I think, to be honest, that is the key ingredient. If you have got the audience insight correct, and you know that that is what the audience want to see, and that is what the consumer has said that they trust or believe from a brand, then I believe that going forward, you just can't get the strategy or the creative wrong, because the audience has said that this is what we want and this is what we love. And as creatives, as marketeers, it's our job to bring that to life in the best way possible for them, in order for them to fall in love with it. And I feel like that is where the creativity becomes more interesting and becomes different, because it's about being able to understand, actually, this is what people want, but we're packaging it in a way where they feel excited about it, even if they've seen it 10 times over. And I think when it comes to looking at creativity, the one thing that I really enjoyed yesterday watching, and I come from an arts background, so maybe this is also a little bit biased, but was the G-Star Raw with the tap and the stomping. And I was just like, it was such an easy way to say these jeans are really durable because you could do anything in them. And it was such a simplistic bit, but they also brought tap and culture and flavor into that short ad. And it wasn't a very long piece at all, but I think being able to show something in that way and expose people again to even to a new artistic way of doing something is really smart. And again, I might just be biased because I love dance, but I think it's I think stuff like that is a really nice way of saying we have something and we're just showing it you in a different way, but we know that this is what you want, because you obviously, everyone wants durable pants, right? Or quality pants. So I feel like that's a really good example. But I just think, yeah, audience first, I think, is always important, and making sure that from the insight, like all the way up to the creative, then yeah, you never stop thinking about the audience.
I love that insight into audience first, and I love that the G-Star campaign, because they also got like a heavy amount of product shots in, like the back of the jeans, the details, all of that in, but not at the expense of like the generosity of the campaign and the tap. It's such a brilliant piece of storytelling. I love that example. And Natasha, I'd love to bring you in here, because this definitely always makes us think a bit differently about how we are approaching our own work, the kind of work that's really resonating, and gives you a bit of a kind of opportunity to look beyond the horizon of the day to day. From your view, what do you think is key to creating brilliant work, but also really on a practical level, giving yourself the time and space to get there?
Yeah, I think time and space is actually really, really important. So really, quite literally, is just taking time out, because like you said, that stat is so interesting. I actually wrote it down about the meetings, the time spent in meetings. I think if it's something like what we did yesterday, it's time out the office, but it's so collaborative. It's so nice to be in different circles as well, speaking with different people, getting new opinions and perspectives. That I think things like that are just so important to bring new ideas back to the team. And then also, I think I saw actually just even on Instagram, like a quote earlier today that is like, creatives need time to do nothing. I think that is, it might be quite cliche, but it is so true. It's just, you really do need that time to switch off, because I think all of us probably know that we get some of our best ideas when we're like having a shower or going for a walk. And it's times when we're actually not on our computer in a meeting, or even having, like a scheduled brainstorm. I think sometimes those can feel a little bit too restrained. So it's about kind of the freedom, I think, of allowing yourself to think a bit bigger and giving yourself the time to do so. But also, just going back to what Shani said, she was absolutely preaching to the choir. I think one of my biggest things about ideas and strategy is the insight. Just insight informs idea is what I always say to my team and stuff, because I think that knowing who you're speaking to is the most important thing, and then the idea should always land from there. So yeah.
I love that point about freedom as well. And Vicky, I'd love to bring you in here, because you're such a champion of copywriting and the craft, and you're a real cheerleader. Like, you've got such a like infectious love for what you do. But what's your advice? Because there's definitely quite a lot of data looking at overwhelm and burnout in the industry, and disproportionately impacting women as well. What's your advice for people who might feel that they've lost their mojo a bit in the wake of the pandemic? I mean, what's the benefit of, I know it's not always easy to take time out from the day to day, but what advice would you give?
I think it might not be easy to take time out, but sometimes you only need 5 minutes, and 5 minutes is nothing in a day. But I mean, the bigger picture is we can't draw on real experiences and present them back to our audience in a relatable way if we aren't living those experiences ourselves. And while obviously recent times hasn't always allowed for socializing and experiencing real life things, there are other ways to find inspiration, like just going for a walk for a start, getting a change of scenery, breathing. I mean, if employees feel they can't do this themselves for fear of lack of presenteeism and other similar issues that are coming up in the work from home, work from office debate, I think companies and agencies should encourage it. I'd like to see companies and agencies book an hour in people's diary to switch off each week. And that's on top of a more understandable, flexible routine and holidays and so on. An hour to switch off or level up, like go to a talk, do a course, watch TV, read a book, walk the dog, play with the kids, doesn't matter. Anything that makes you think and feel differently will help you think and feel differently about your work.
That's such a brilliant point, and I think a great point to end on as well. I think the Gerety Awards have really given us an opportunity to really have a bit of a break from the day-to-day and learn and listen to each other. So thank you all so much for making the time to join us today to share some of that insight. And I think from respecting each other's time to remembering that creativity is a team sport, there's lots of insights which I think will inspire the audience to continue to keep trying. That's always the main thing, to make the best work of their lives and be inspired by the creative benchmarks that the Gerety Awards set. So thank you so much, and thank you everyone for tuning in.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.